Thank you so much, Carter. We appreciate that. Ron, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Very
I know
good.
we're doing long distance here.
That's right. I'm Mike Simmons, and both Ron and I are in Denton, Texas, although we're separated by about 3 miles in different places today. But thank you all for joining this, and we are assuming that a number of you have repeated from previous weeks, but we don't want to make that full assumption, so I'm going to spend a few moments just going through what we had covered in the previous 2 sessions, and then Ron will walk through some of our new content for today. But if you were with us before, you'll know that our whole conversation has been about outcomes and using those outcomes for various purposes, ranging from feedback to students and instructors to determining learning outcomes to institutional reporting, etc. And so today we hope to weave all that together into some meaningful picture for you. And today I think we're the furthest out theoretically than we have been. This is not a new area for us, but with ExamSoft we've been exploring some things that we want to share. So our agenda for today is we're going to review parts number 1 and 2. We're going to evaluate use the outcomes in terms of talking about evaluating teaching and learning strategies. Then we're going to talk about outcome attainment values in terms of AAC&U, tuning, Lumina, DQP, and other kinds of national or international standards to which we're all aspiring. And then finally, we're going to bring it back to where we started, which is at the course level, because that's where the outcomes and things come from. So we're going to talk a little bit about our experience with course design and the impact of outcomes on instruction. So without further ado, I'll move through a basic review of what we did in our previous 2 seminars. And our basic premise is based on an outcome-based assessment model. And this is from Dr. Carriveau's book called Connecting the Dots. Ron and I have worked together for 5 years now, and I know he's been working on this for a number of years, and our philosophy, I think, is based on these concepts. But you will find that there's no particular copyright on this. This is something that's probably pretty common to your way of thinking in terms of the sort of the cycle here, and you'll see it that outcome statements need to be written and understood, and then there need to be assessments, and then there needs to be an evaluation and an improvement. It's the old cycle, and that's why we have outcome attainment measures. And so we've talked to you about a very specific coding structure, a 3-level model for how you begin to get at this within the course itself. And just very quickly to repeat, you see the 3 levels on the screen. You're going to code test items to specific learning outcomes. And at the goal level, the general learning outcome level, and the specific learning outcome level matched up against a test item. And as you'll see, it doesn't matter whether it's multiple choice or constructed response. The idea is that this granular level of learning can be measured and tracked. So that's the basics of the 3-level model, and we'd be happy to follow up on that more later. So where ExamSoft came into the picture is the ability to begin tagging and accumulating these values meaningfully. In other words, we could all do this structure, and we did for many years by hand, by spreadsheet, etc. But when we started working with ExamSoft, we found that there was a way to do this in volume and to produce information that was meaningful for the purpose of course and institutional improvement. So as you can see on the screen, there's a link between the calculation of outcomes at the item level on the far left, the idea that there are 4 items tied to a specific outcome, and in those 4 items, the percentage of students who had this correct or passed it is averaged, and then those 3 specific outcomes together combine to average to a general outcome, and then finally toward a goal. So this 3-level structure averages upward, and we'll be using that basis to discuss how this works at a broader level today, but I wanted to make sure that you remember the framework there, and that's at the course level, which is where the data always comes from. So one of the interesting things about ExamSoft is the ability to report that same kind of information meaningfully to the instructor and the student and the institution. In this case, you're seeing a summary report from one of our chemistry classes, and you can see the assessment performance of the student, overall scoring on the top. But on the bottom is the really interesting part that we work with mostly, and that has to do with attainment at the student outcome level, all three levels, in fact. And you'll see that for this class, this faculty member has a pretty good idea of where the students stand in terms of each of the learning objectives. Similarly, and the next report you're seeing is an essay version. The previous was a multiple choice, but it can also be done in terms of rubric-based assessment. Similar kind of view of the attainment of learning outcomes. Now, one of the things that we've been able to address with ExamSoft is sort of this longitudinal looking over the course of student or goals, or in other words, looking at it a variety of ways, not just a single incident of assessment, but looking at it across a course, or looking at it across a set of courses, or looking at it longitudinally by student or by objective. And those are all views that we all strive to get, and we've been able to partner with ExamSoft and build some of those. One of the important things about this is formative assessment. And most of our faculty who use this tool are strong believers in formative assessment, which means ongoing feedback, in many cases a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and that builds sort of the accumulated evidence toward learning outcomes. An example from our chemistry class is the performance on quizzes for 2 course sections, and then Dr. Petrus is addressing particular issues or learning outcomes that he saw problems with, and then the improvement in their summative performance. And I think you can see that indicated here in the formative quizzing as opposed to the summative performance report. All right. So here's the other concept that we want to bring out that we mentioned before, the idea of census versus sampling. And this is intended to be a little bit provocative in language, but I think you'll get the point. You know, many of us at an institutional level sample in order to measure outcomes, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But I think the premise, that statement that I've made and Dr. Carriveau made is, if you could, in fact, get learning outcome attainment values from every student, why wouldn't you? And I think that's the road we're trying to go down here as a valid set of evidence, using attainment values from individual students would be the way to go. So we hope to talk today about how from the course level and individual student level, it builds a culture of evidence of impact in drawing data from each particular student. Okay, so Ron, do you want to take it over here?
My phone started ringing, and
yeah, I hear that.
We're also very concerned with validity. That's always an important issue. And in the previous sessions, we've talked about what happens if you have a flawed item and how to fix it. But we're just going to make 2 points quickly here. One is that if the item writer has violated the item writing guidelines for what to do and not to do when you're writing items, that will create a flawed item. And the second thing to look at is the validity of the item itself, which is the statistical part of it. And typically, if an item is not answered correctly by, if it is answered correctly by less than 50% of the students, then there's probably something wrong with that item, and typically it's the guidelines. And then to follow up, looking at the statistics of the item, ExamSoft provides a complete analysis, and we talked about this previously too. And this is where you actually look at all the questions and the options and see how they're functioning. And of course, if you have a poorly functioning item and you've identified it's probably flawed because of not following item writing rules, after you do fix it and you are following the rules, then of course the statistics will change. And today we're going to look at a little bit more specific area, and that's learning strategies and how this model and the values that we get, the attainment values, apply to a specific learning strategy. And there are many, many different strategies that are being used, called learning activities, learning strategies, teaching activities, teaching strategies. And these are just a few, just to remind all of us that there are a lot of different ways to get at an instructional model. But within that model, we don't always know how well it operates. So we can do a better job of evaluating the instruction if we can tie it to this outcome attainment structure. And this is an example of a marketing course. And this assignment was given to the students. And you can briefly read it there. You can see it's about memory capacities in terms of ultimately making selections for sales. But the question is why? Why ask students to do this particular activity? And the answer is always because we want to be ensured that they'll do well on any assessment that's given on particular outcomes. So the reason this activity was given was not because they wanted to work together and we're going to evaluate that. That also could be done, but specifically we want these particular outcomes to have a high degree of attainment.
Now, Ron, one of the things that people asked in the previous 2 weeks was who set these outcomes, who decided on this, and I just want to report in this case, in most cases, it's that faculty member. In other words, that faculty member is designing this particular activity and mapping that to these specific learning outcomes. That generally is the way it works, or a faculty member will inherit a course, but they still own that process, and that's the approach we've always taken.
And so with that in mind, you can see the relationship between the outcomes and what actually the students performed. So using the model of taking the grassroots percentage of students answering items correctly, we can see that those 4 items in the first column group together to provide a measure of the SLO 1.2.3. And the next 3 items measured 1.3.2, and the next 2 measured 2.1.2. And you can see the attainment on the 1.3.2 here in the middle was quite high, and the attainment for the 2.1.2 is quite low. In fact, it's right at the border of saying, do I possibly have a flawed item to work with here that I have to fix or check at least? But it could also be this is a very difficult area. Although I typically feel that if I've spent a semester with students going over these outcomes and providing experiential activities for them to be able to achieve it, I would expect more than a 53. Now the first group of items that measured 1.2.3, we can see averaged out at 69, which is okay, but notice item number 4 only had 38% of the students answering that item correctly. So that is a problem item. And the advice in literature is just don't count it as part of the student score. But it needs to be fixed, and then if it falls anywhere within this range, you can see that this will jump way up. So because of one flawed item, we're not able to get a valid measure of 1.2.3, and that's why we don't use it. We'll go fix it, try it again. Now, here's another group activity. This time it's a problem set. The reason we bring it up is because typically higher order thinking type of measurement is associated with problem sets. You usually need more than one item to get at critical thinking, for example. So here in question 1, this particular specific learning outcome was being addressed for this particular goal and this particular GLO. Now goal 3, which had a couple of specific learning outcomes, is addressed by question 2, which specifically looks at 3.2.2, and question 3 looks at also 3.2.2. And you can see these are a little more lower level recall. Here's making a choice, but here's making somewhat of a conclusion for a final product. And question 4, though, is a reasoning question. So that's going to get a little bit more at what we call higher order thinking. Now these are only 4 items, but they can be coded to and they can be tagged with ExamSoft, and we can just look at the student's performance on those items. Of course, there's not enough information to get a reading on a reliability coefficient, but that's not the focus here. It's how did students benefit from having that activity? And it could be there's high benefit or low benefit. For this student, it was certainly high, because you can see the student got 100% on the items that were asked on whatever assessment was given. And here's another student. This one has a few things to work on. Their score was 75. But now imagine if you had 5 students in that group and you had these measures, and you took these measures back to them to the table and said, you were working as a group to try to help each other achieve this particular outcome, these particular sets of outcomes, and here's how you all scored, and then they could discuss and again be retested, because it might be a formative assessment model that you're using. But this would be a great learning device in addition to informing the instructor and the student, because this, where it says strengths and improvement opportunities, is an individual student report. If it had been an essay test that was given, then of course you would have the rubric, and the student, again, because it's strengths and improvements, could see how each individual student did. And these are always the rows of a rubric, and the students could look at that also. And that moves us into some new territory, and this is kind of what's on the radar these days. Many of you are probably familiar with AAC&U, possibly you're familiar with tuning. I only recently was, and the DQP. So we're going to talk about each of these in relationship to coding into this model so we can eventually report it at the level that it needs to be reported. Now, AAC&U uses the LEAP critical thinking value rubrics, plus there are 16 others. But we're just going to focus on the rubric for the critical thinking for our presentation here. And I'm sure you know AAC&U is an association of colleges and universities, and their LEAP model was developed and grew into the value rubric, and the LEAP stands for the learning learning as promised, a liberal education as promised. Almost forgot that. I just always refer to it as LEAP, but it's liberal education as promised. And then the value is capitalized because those letters stand for valid assessment of learning in undergraduate education. And we do have to address these on our campus because of our Board of Education demanding it at the state level. So here is one of the LEAP value rubrics, the one that measures critical thinking. And as you know, the outcome statements are typically on the left-hand column, so each row then represents an outcome statement, and the information in the middle are criteria that would help you judge the degree to which a student achieved that on a scale of 4 to 1. What's missing here, though, is some coding on the left-hand side, so this can be related to other things. And in fact, it's a very, to actually teach this as represented would be very difficult. And even on the back side of the rubrics put out by the LEAP rubrics, it says this is just an example. You have to customize it for your particular institution and your particular needs. But to make it a little more usable, I mapped it out with the 3-level model, and this was the one overall goal, that, of course, demonstrate ability to think critically. And by doing these things, which things then get listed down here. So you can see the 1.1, the 1.2, the 1.3, the 1.4, and the 1.5 are what we call general learning outcomes that help explain more what the goal is. But they're all not very measurable. So then we'd have to go to these other levels, the specific levels, and teach these things to be able to infer that the student can do the 1.2. This is a lot of stuff. If you were to really cover this thoroughly in a class, I think it would interfere with your actual discipline and your outcomes for that you're trying to teach. But keep in mind that even if this is, say, given with a written response, so that rubric is used because they match, this is what you see on each line, each row, I should say, of the rubric. But you're still teaching this. It hasn't gone away. So with the model, now you can approach this with other types of assessment too. You could do scenarios or vignettes, like law schools and medical schools are now doing a lot of. They're converting to using those types of assessment because you're more able to use selected response items with it, and they still do some writing. So AAC&U is interested at the program level, at the institutional level also. So let's see what this would look like if we were trying to build the critical thinking into a larger scale on campus. And here you have an institutional strategic goal 1, 2, and 3. Notice the 1 is critical thinking. That's definitely a student learning outcome. Then there's another goal to increase enrollment, and the third one to have something that has something to do with community relations. So those are more program goals. And now let's look at just program A. And in a program, the program level folks are going to be very interested in matching, of course, the institutional goals. So again, they're also interested in critical thinking, increase in enrollment, and community relations. But as we've been demonstrating at the course level, you're going to ask students to demonstrate their abilities, proficiencies, competencies, and measure it in a way that you can communicate with these other levels. And that's what happens with this model, where goal 1 in course 1 has some of those outcome statements that we just looked at for critical thinking mapped into their instruction. And in course 2, their goal 1 had the critical thinking mapped in. In course 3, used their critical thinking in goal 2. So putting those values together, you can come up with a valid number, a valid value for critical thinking that this program can then report to the institutional level. And notice it changed from 78 to 82. That's because more than one program is going to be addressing goal 1 at the institutional level. So this maps in the critical thinking from the AAC&U LEAP rubrics. And because it was an essay and it was given through ExamSoft, you can actually see then those 5 outcome statements that were on the left-hand side of the model when I broke it out into all the levels. So students are explaining issues, they're providing evidence, they're addressing influences, they're taking positions, and they're stating conclusions, all of which are found in the value rubric. And of course, the faculty also gets back a list of students at risk, and then the performance for this rubric is again broken down like an item analysis for multiple choice. This is a rubric analysis. And because it is a little difficult to try to work in the entire value rubric, it could be incorporated into items that you're using in your discipline by stating things like the student will demonstrate critical reasoning regarding the role of social inequity in society. This may be a poli-sci class. And because the words critical reasoning are used, and they're also used in the rubric, the LEAP rubric, you have a connection made. Just has to be coded. Or this might be from a history class. You ask students to read some particular thing critically and analytically from a historian's viewpoint. And you could ask the student to apply steps of the scientific research process, which is the scientific method, which is already critical thinking, to an analysis of whatever. And as just a general statement, I've seen faculty use this to their advantage. Is that students will demonstrate critical thinking regarding, and so you kind of have an open choice at the end there. And no matter which way you do it, you will get your rubric analysis if you use ExamSoft, and you can go back and see how well did that, what I asked and the model that I used and how it functioned, how well did it do the job I was expecting? How well did my rubric perform? Now we come to a bigger area, the DQP, and I'm sure some of you at least have heard of this, and some maybe not. As you see at the bottom, the source for what I'm going to put on the screen is from the Lumina Foundation, and they have a really nice booklet out. It's got nice glossy covers and everything, and glossy pages, and it talks about the DQP, the Degree Qualifications Program, and the book is called the Degree Qualifications Profile. Now it's very, very broad. But it's moving in a direction that involves what's happening at each institution, because it provides an architectural profile for 3 higher education degrees, the associate, bachelor's, and master's. And it spells out 5 areas of learning that they call proficiencies, and they associate them with these 5 areas are associated with the model regardless of the field of study. So they're very broad. They're going across institutions, they're going across disciplines. And the Lumina Foundation that supports this and by the way, the DQP was developed with folks from NILOA, the National Institute for Learning Outcome Assessment, and they've worked with Lumina now, and Lumina is known as an organization whose sole mission is to increase college attainment. And the DQP is interested in proficiency. Keep that word in mind. And it relates to or designates the knowledge, understanding, and skill that satisfy the levels of mastery sufficient to justify the award of the academic degree. So they're moving into a very, very broad area, very difficult to map into the 3-level model, and we're still waiting to see how all this develops to see what we could do with that. It was interesting to me, at least, that the DQP also in the packet what they put out talks about study that is pursued beyond traditional academic locations. So they're talking about on or off campus, and it mentions words like real time, that the students be working in real time, real space, and real urgency. I mean, they're going to be immersed in the issues and in the environment. So this is a very broad way to look at education in terms of attaining one of those degrees.
Ron, could I throw something in here?
Yes.
A number of our attendees are primarily teaching, and I want to help make the connection if you're sitting there thinking, well, what does this have to do with me in the classroom? And I think the answer is generally you can see this, but more specifically it's the external pressures being placed on higher education from the political and policy world, from our accountability partners and the accrediting agencies. In other words, whether you like it or not, or whether you agree with it or not, these are the kinds of broad policy level efforts that are happening, and they are in fact sort of blanketed on top of the work that we're doing. And the challenge that Ron and I have faced is, okay, we're all in the world of outcomes and attainment and working in the classroom, and then these things sort of come in and get thrown out, and they're not terribly foreign, but the fact is they are here to stay. And what we're trying to do is make that intellectual and practical connection between these larger picture almost requirements or expectations and the work that you're doing in the classroom. That's our goal in talking about these larger initiatives.
Okay, thanks, Mike. That's a really good point. And just briefly, here are the 5 broad areas that are called proficiencies and that are expected to be attained at some degree of proficiency for each of the degrees, A, B, and M. And they're specialized knowledge, and you can see that includes the tuning field, which we're going to talk about. And some of you may be familiar with that because in your disciplines, tuning deals with specific disciplines and involves folks from across campuses and all the different fields in a particular discipline. And another area in which folks need to be proficient in to get a degree would be the broad and integrative knowledge. In other words, consolidating knowledge from different fields. And then number 3, intellectual skills, which also maps into LEAP pretty well. And that's analytic inquiry and the other things you can see listed there. The other big area is applied and collaborative learning. In other words, what students do with what they know. And the last big area is civic and global learning, and these deal with responsibilities to democracy and the global community. So let's see how far we can get now with a course level, discipline level area, and that involves Tuning USA. I wasn't familiar with this till this last year, but these quotes are coming from the Lumina Foundation booklet, and the whole concept of tuning, which means kind of like in an orchestra, you're tuning all the instruments. Well, in this case, you're tuning parts of a particular discipline, and you're dealing with folks in the orchestra who've come from maybe other institutions or other disciplines associated with the one you're working in. And it was inspired by the work of the Tuning Educational Structures in Europe Association back in 2000. And what it does, it encourages faculty members in multiple institutions to collaborate with one another within their discipline, and also working with employers in order to define outcomes that are appropriate to the different stages of progress toward a degree in those disciplines. So you can see a little connection being made now between tuning and DQP. But notice too that tuning uses the word competency. The DQP uses the word proficiency. And the DQP, which encourages individual institutions to define learning outcomes appropriate to the degree it offers, is irrespective of the discipline. So tuning is discipline specific, the DQP is broader than that. And tuning brings together the academic communities necessary, and this is from the pamphlet, for finer articulations and acceptance of the DQP. So DQP recognized, and I was at a conference session where the NILOA folks who developed the DQP were talking about this and said, we didn't realize we needed to have a closer association with all the tuning organizations because they're also a big influence on accreditation, the professional accreditation for your discipline. So the connections are being made, and I think the bottom line is that for faculty member, for educators, is that the faculty will develop assignments that enable students to demonstrate the competencies from tuning and the map to the proficiencies of the DQP. It still comes back to faculty, the classroom, and the students. And at the last IUPUI conference, when Trudy Banta gave the keynote talk, she started out with saying, assessment always comes back down to the student and the course level. That's where you start. So for a solution to all of this new information that we have to supply now to different places and incorporate into our assignments and our classroom, our solution to the model is to use a 3-level model to code competencies and proficiencies and map course level attainment values to both. And we've already talked about it being valuable because it's a census model and it can map back up to institutional levels. So let's see what this looks like. We already talked about the 3-level model, and this is vertical mapping. The model works horizontally also. And we talked a little bit about the census approach. This is just a review slide. But here are the pieces. Let's talk about just critical thinking with the 3-level model and links from the AAC&U rubrics, as well as links to whatever tuning USA comes up with for outcomes. We'll only look at one program and with 3 different courses. So the institutional level is ultimately probably where some of the DQP is going to be reported. Those values are going to be reported for satisfying that, and possibly some of the tuning. But at the program level, and notice we have just one program here, chemistry, where it has 3 outcomes as an example, goal 1, goal 2, and goal 3. One being critical thinking, one being written communication, one being teamwork, that somehow these have to map up then to those strategic goals. But they would also map very closely with tuning. And of course, here's our whole course structure, and there we have the 1, 1.1, 1.1.1, and here are the 2 areas where we're going to draw from to make sure that those get incorporated into our course measures. So we could say that the value rubrics were mapped into the chemistry course 1 and chemistry course 2 and chemistry course 3, which is just in chemistry because we've used it in the previous presentations. It could be any course. And then we can say, yes, we've covered it because our words in our goals do match the words in the syntax and that is in the value rubrics. And also, you know, if we have tuning outcomes, because these at least are nice laid out student learning outcomes, and I know engineering has their discipline accreditation has excellent outcomes they've been using for years, and nursing schools do, so they all map into this nicely. So now we have information going into the course that can be measured. The information comes in as outcomes, gets measured, and we can get a value, an attainment outcome value that will map up then, oops, going backwards, that will map up to the critical thinking outcome or goal for the program, which can then be calculated from the 3 different courses and mapped up to the institution. So in reality, the course rules. The instructor is then asked to make, as was in the last slide, they're asked to come up with the activities that are going to enable students to do this type of critical thinking and to come up with a way to measure it so it can be reported. And here's a summary report of critical thinking items that we, again, just made up. And here are what we've looked at previously, because you have all the information you need for outcome attainment values here, but you can double tag and triple tag in ExamSoft. So now I also have a value for the AAC&U critical thinking with 4 items, and I have a value for tuning in case it's needed. So in reality, we can say we measured what tuning asked and we measured what AAC&U asked, and we can report it individually, singly, or we can just tell you it's all combined in here. Now, before we didn't have 3 different courses. We had, 3 different programs. Here we do. Same idea. And again, we map in from the sources. And this time, we're mapping in something from political science, something from chemistry, and something from history, because we have those 3 courses now that are going to contribute to the programs. And because they're all addressing critical thinking from the outcomes from tuning or the rubric from AAC&U, those will map up to the program. So now we have 3 different programs that all measure critical thinking in terms of the common language that might occur within AAC&U, and probably at least common within the discipline, but generally they're going to be similar wordings. And so the institution can then report the outcomes at their level. But again, you can see it's all related, again, to the courses. In fact, in my mind, the folks at the course level should be recommending what the program level outcomes should state. But they're always built from the top down. So there's some communication areas that need to be improved in there. Okay, and so this concludes a model that we feel is very usable. We've been using it. We have not yet gotten into the next levels here with the leap values and the tuning, but it's on the horizon. So now to conclude, I asked Mike to do number 4 because he leads the university effort in the program that we have for developing better courses.
Thanks, Ron. And where we want to go with this last part is to bring it back to where we started, and that is at the course level. Ron just said, ideally all outcomes are driven from the course level. Sometimes that doesn't happen because of a variety of political or institutional factors, but in this structure, the measurement of attainment and learning is at the course level. So what we've done over the past number of years in our next gen course redesign project, which, as was mentioned earlier, was our QEP almost 8 years ago now, but we've done thousands of sections and over 50-some thousand students and hundreds of instructors through the program, which doesn't make us wonderful. It just means that we've had an opportunity to make a lot of mistakes and learn from them. So our assumptions that we're making here and the 6 steps that I want to walk through very quickly are based on our experience. And it didn't start this way. It has evolved over the years. These things will be in the PowerPoint, so I'm not going to read these following slides. They're pretty text heavy, but I will skim over them. Have time for questions. So, number 1, determining that course content. Absolutely the important thing, and generally the faculty owns it. I'll just say this, for us, that's generally a narrowing down exercise with faculty, not a building. Folks walk in with sometimes hundreds of things they're going to cover in a course. And what we end up working with is what can you realistically cover. And so it's a limiting exercise, not a building exercise. Step number 2 is determining those specific outcomes. As we said, most times a faculty member has some vague idea or general idea or have been given some general standards. But what we're talking about is these specific, measurable level outcomes. And that we find is just about the hardest part of the process, to work our way to that measurable attainment value at the SLO level. So then what do you do with the course except to create an outcome-based structure? So you know what you want the students to be able to do and to know, and as a result you build the course. Finally, or not finally, but the next step is how do we assess that? And we've talked about this earlier, mapping these specific learning outcomes to test items so that we can gain these attainment values that you've been seeing how they've been used at various levels. So we're creating the test items and mapping them, and then doing the kind of item analysis and reflective analysis that Ron has talked about over the past 3 weeks so we can get a sense of their effectiveness. And step number 5 is to make an instructional plan. In our experience, many course redesign or design programs begin here, and they start talking about how you're going to teach. And what we've really come about to is the teaching comes, you know, as you can see, 5 steps in the process. Sometimes we don't talk about teaching for several months, and it's kind of a weird thing for most faculty, but eventually they see there's a little bit of method in our madness. And then finally, the evaluation of the course design and making improvements. We've talked about how to use these pieces of data, these assessments, to make improvements in the course. And the one thing I want to point out here is we are on the verge of, we think, almost real-time feedback with tools like ExamSoft and learning management systems and some of these competency-based feedback formative tools that our publisher partners are coming out with. We're not talking after the semester improvements. We're talking after the class or each week kind of changes based on the measurement of formative and summative learning outcomes. So that's a really interesting place where I think we all are. I won't use the word competency here, but you can see this sort of goes down that road. So we have appreciated the time and interest of everyone, and Carter, at this point, we're going to stop and then see if there are any particular questions to answer.